שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי. עזרי מעם השם, עושה שמיים וארץ. אל ייתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך. הנה לא ינום ולא יישן שומר ישראל. השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך. יומם השמש לא יככה, וירח בלילה. השם ישמורך מכל רע.
I'd like to begin today by asking our Haitian heroes to take a stand. If you went to Haiti this last couple of weeks, would you stand up just for a second so everybody can see where you're at? Yeah, there you are, Carrie. I know there's some of y'all. You're not just heroes because you flew in at midnight or at first service either, by the way. I learned a couple of things that I want to share with y'all real quick. One, I want you to know that the elders have been working tirelessly. Like one elder got up at 4 a.m. to get on the phone with a helicopter company and just worked all day trying to figure out how to evacuate them. And anyway, just a lot of prayer and effort has gone into getting them home. But also, I want you to know this was not a failure. The mission of God is to show the world what God is like. And often we're a people who love the book of Acts. Do you realize they experienced what the book of Acts was like more than almost anything else? Which is going into uncertain places where there's social risk or there's a social revolt, and trying to show the world by service what God is like. And so I just want to say, your mission trip was incredibly successful, and I'm very proud of y'all. I'm very proud to know you. Yeah. So now a hard left. Today is my mom's birthday, and it's the first time that I have ever been my mom's preacher on her birthday on a Sunday. So I'm going to tell you a story, and I need to tell you, I have my mom's permission to tell you this story, and I also need to tell you it was very hard to get that permission. Because about 30 years ago to the day, we were at the Gravel Hill Church of Christ in Dover, Arkansas, and I was this little 8-year-old boy. I was homeschooled my entire life, which meant I was very sheltered, and I did not know what certain words meant. But I hung out with people who weren't homeschooled. For the sake of this teaching, we'll call those people pagans, and they used certain words that I didn't know what they meant, but they rhymed. And so at the end of Gravel Hill Church of Christ service, since my mom's related to 2/3 of the people there, they knew it was her birthday, and they decided, my Uncle Ricky turned around and said, let's sing Nene happy birthday. So they sing happy birthday to my mom, and at the end, her little boy yells out at the top of his lungs, and many more, kick her out the door, because she's a promiscuous woman. Except I didn't say promiscuous woman. And the way I remember it is like, and everything stopped. Everybody looks at this 8-year-old kid, and Dad grabs me and drags me outside where we had a little talk, but I don't remember talking that much. I say all that to say, did you ever feel like you didn't belong in church? Or that church people were out to call you out for something, or that God was against you, waiting for you to make a mistake and point it out to everybody? Well, I have good news for you this morning. It's the sermon title. And the news is actually so good, it's the best-selling book of all time. And today we're going to get to a story in it that's just one part of this book that's in something called The Good News according to Luke. And there's a reason we call it good news. It's because deep down, it's the news that you're in your bones you've been waiting for. And sometimes we get the news wrong. It's not good news that if you get every single thing right theologically, then you get to go to heaven. Because if you think that's the good news, let me tell you what happens. You become very, very anxious. Because what if you're ever wrong? It's not the good news that if you work really, really hard, then God's going to let you into heaven. Because what if you ever forget to do something? Or what if you're just tired and take a day off? Today we're going to get to something that is at the heart of why people have called this good news across the globe and for thousands of years. And it's one of those things that if you grew up with this idea in the back of your mind that God is somehow against you or out to get you, or that God is hoping that you will get something wrong so He can send you to hell, the story we're going to talk about today, it literally can change your life. If you've ever had this suspicion in the back of your mind that when you stand before God, you won't measure up by whatever rule stick that you've got or you've been given, that you haven't done enough to be okay, or you're worried about your eternal salvation or whether God is proud of you, this is going to be big. So we're in a series called Prodigy. It's going through the Gospel of Luke. And we're in a story today that's so important, we have to go to a couple of other places first. I want to begin by asking the question, did you ever wonder why the verse that Jesus quotes repeatedly to the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, the verse that He quotes over and over again is Hosea 6. Go and learn what this means. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. If you're the Pharisees, at some point, don't you think, is that all the Bible you know, Jesus? Like, go get another verse. But Jesus repeatedly quotes that verse to them. I told you a few weeks ago about how Les and I were in India a few years ago, and we saw a goat being sacrificed in a religious festival. And today that sounds primitive to us, but all over the world, people still do that. And for historically speaking, it's a new idea that we wouldn't do that. Sacrifice is a big part of human religion. So my Uncle Blondie, a few years ago, many years ago, was out on his land, and he came across one of his cows that had been ritually sacrificed by like devil worshipers or something. And I still remember him saying, look, if you're going to worship the devil, fine, but sacrifice your own cow. Why do people do this? Here's one. There's something inside you. Chances are, earlier when I was saying all that stuff about God is not out to get you and He's not waiting for you to do something wrong, that He's not just waiting to send us to hell. Chances are, when I said that stuff, if you grew up in church, you're like me. And there's something that went off in the back of your head. If you've lived enough life, not even if you grew up in church, but if you've lived enough life and you've seen other people's consequences for their decision, or maybe your own consequences, there's a little voice that goes off in your head when you hear somebody like me say something that good about God. And the little voice in your head says something like, yeah, but, because, and there is a big but here. Yeah, God is good, and yeah, God is love, but people hurt each other. We lie, and we cheat, and we steal, and we're hateful, and mean, and cruel. And what does God do about that? One of the reasons I'm a Christian is because it names reality better than any other story I know. It names evil better than any other story that I know. And this is important because we live in a world, a post-Christian world that is coming to Arkansas. We live in a time and place where the word sin is starting to become an adjective for things like chocolate. Sin means, being a little bit naughty. For a lot of people, it still has a religious meaning, but for a lot of people, it's just a word that is a great advertisement, right? Just this last week, I read in the New York Times this article written by a woman who grew up in a fundamentalist religious home, and the article was titled, Raising My Children Without Sin. She didn't ever want to use the word sin or teach her kids the concept of sin, and she was bragging on that. But it's not people just on the outside of Christianity. These days, even in church, we don't talk about sin. You know what? We like to talk, especially about our sin. We like to talk about the mistakes we make, right? Yeah, I made a mistake. It was wrong. I feel bad about that mistake that I made. But have you ever noticed? Sometimes you plan your mistakes. Sometimes we put our mistakes on calendars for the future. It's not just mistakes we make. The appropriate word is sin. And yeah, that sounds like a word for intolerant and narrow-minded and small people. Unless you start to remember those times in your life where everything falls apart and you're at the center of why it fell apart. Have you ever wondered why we're like this, why we're so destructive, or closer to home, why you do such destructive things? Have you ever found yourself looking in the mirror wondering how you're going to explain this to people? how you're going to explain it to your spouse or your friends or your parents, or how what started out as a fun pastime became an addiction. The bad news about Christianity is not just the bad news about people out there. It's about each one of us. The way the Apostle Paul says it is that the wages, the payment of sin is death. And that is universal. Every single one of us. We have sinned. We're all sinners. There's no safe place to stand. And here's the dark part of that. That thing that was in Jeffrey Dahmer that caused him to do those heinous things, that thing that was in Hitler, that thing that was in Pol Pot and in Stalin, the thing that's in the worst of people, Christians recognize we're family with that. That's in every one of us. Christianity demands we come to grips with this. Some days we feel noble and wonderful, but on most days we know that's not the whole truth about us. There's this dirty, staining thing called sin. And yeah, there's guilt. If you grew up in the Bible Belt like a lot of us, you're familiar with guilt. And sure, God's grace is sufficient, and sure, God is love, and Mr. Rogers told us we were special. But yet, that song we sang earlier, Amazing Grace, that saves like me. If you're coming in today and you're, new to church, you might start thinking, wretch? There it is, that religious self-hatred. This is the stuff I was being warned about. Does it make a difference when you find out that John Newton, the guy who wrote that song, was a slave trader? Some of y'all probably knew that. You knew that he, became a abolitionist. But do you know he wrote Amazing Grace while he was still a slave trader? Changes that word, doesn't it? Now, wretch is a perfectly apt description of the guy. And yeah, the grace that taught his heart to fear would eventually lead him to start fighting slavery. But that's an appropriate title for him, isn't it? There's a darkness that lurks in all of us, in the back of our minds. We laugh at stories we shouldn't. We tell those stories. We lie. We envy. We are mean. We wish harm on others. Sometimes we cause that harm. We blame. We lose our temper. We cause death in a million different ways. We sin. And now you're ready for Jesus, almost. Because in order to appreciate Jesus and what Jesus does in the story today, we have to go to a place where a lot of yearly Bible reading plans die. The book of Leviticus. Turning your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 1. We're just going to read the first couple of verses. It says, the Lord called to Moses, and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. And he said, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. So Leviticus is going to go through, it's going to begin with these detailed instructions, very detailed instructions on how to offer 5 different kinds of sacrifices: burnt offering, grain offering, peace offering, sin offering, and guilt offering. Blood, guilt, sin, this is a party waiting to happen, right? Leviticus has these incredibly detailed instructions on how you can kill an animal, like basically what you do with the fat of the animal, with the loins of the animal, and with the blood, because there's lots of blood. But notice what it says. When you bring an offering or draw near to God, that's the word, the Hebrew word there is korban. Let me hear you say korban. It means draw near. The gods at the time, all the other gods in the ancient world were seen as detached and distant. But this is a different kind of word from a different kind of God. When you draw near to God, you can draw near to God. See, the thing that was so terrifying in the ancient world is you never knew where you stood with the gods. If the rain came, then you gave sacrifices. But you didn't know how much sacrifice to give, right? And then if the rain didn't come, you assumed the gods were angry. So you got to give more sacrifices. And then the next time, in order to make sure the rain comes. So it's this never-ending scale of anxiety. And the reason God is so specific here in Leviticus is letting us know, this is what you do. You don't need to do more. I'm not coming at this from a thing of, they better stay away from me. No, you could draw near to this God. The details of Leviticus would have had a calming effect, reassuring you that you're not doing this incorrectly. This God is different than other gods. The people reading Leviticus would have known. This God is saying, you can be at peace with me. And what happens if you're going through life and suddenly you realize you did something wrong? Or you feel guilty for something you did years ago. Or what happens when you accidentally run over your neighbor's cow or whatever? What do? How can there be reconciliation? There was an offering for that. For those things that would bring deep anxiety. There was an offering for that too. I know it sounds bloody and primitive, but in its day, this was a huge relief. People knew they could be at peace with God and with each other. And the reason sacrifices happen is because the things that they did really were bad things. They really, people had adultery then. People did all kinds of things that we haven't evolved with the same kinds of people. And then would they take that lamb or that goat, and when they would slit its throat and watch the blood drain from the animal, they were being reminded of what they knew was true. Their sin brings death. There are consequences to what we do to each other with blood. So we recently moved into my childhood home after remodeling, and we had a lot of PV people over to pray for it a few months ago. On that day, since it's our family land, my brother Curtis, who's a hunter, killed a deer on our land, and then he was cleaning it and got a little blood on him, on his face. Little is not the right amount of, copious amounts of blood got on my brother. And so when we pulled up before everybody else did, we said, "Hey, Curtis, you got blood on your face." And he was like, "Oh, yeah." He's thinking it's just a little bit. But it's not. It's a lot. And so he doesn't clean off. And then PV people start coming over to our house, and my brother looks like Dexter. So just blood all over. And at one point, he's dressed in camo. He's in the doorway. There's 30 or 40 people in the house, and some other people are coming in who have never been out in the country at our house before. And my brother, who they don't know, turns around looking like a serial killer, and he goes, "Y'all, come on, get on here. That's the last time they've ever been at our house. And I say that because there's something about blood that gets your attention. We get squeamish around it. And there's a part of me, when you read Leviticus, you think, why did God set it up like this? I'll tell you why. Whenever I read Leviticus, I think of Heinrich Himmler, the Nazi who planned out all the death camps and fainted at the sight of blood. Because that's what we like to do with sin, specifically our sin. We like to keep it abstract, like it's an idea. But every time those Israelites would make this sacrifice, they were being reminded, this is what my actions do. We bring death into our world, into our relationships, into our friendships, our marriages, and our homes. And these sacrifices were a way of keeping front and center that sin is never abstract. It's something we do to each other. But the human heart is really slippery, and it's good at hiding the truth, especially from ourselves. So imagine if what started off as a way of giving confidence as you stood before God and the ability to heal relationships with other people. Imagine if human heart and pride started making that do the exact opposite. What if people started saying, you know what, these aren't enough details. We need to add some stuff to what God is saying. What if we need to make sure we're not getting the sacrifices wrong on any level? What if these people started thinking that God still was angry and against them, and that somehow by doing these sacrifices, they were keeping God pacified? And what if the people, the religious leaders who were doing the sacrifices, claimed to have figured out an even better prescription for doing the sacrifices just right so that they could get people less angry, get God less angry with people? That's what happened. Through the course of thousands of years, what you just read, those stories in Leviticus and more, they started adding to their own traditions. They became more and more focused on their traditions and their form of the sacrifices than the principle of why God was having them do it. And that brings us to Jesus and the Gospel of Luke. So Jesus is partying with all the wrong people, right? We saw last week, no one is unclean to Jesus. So he's eating and drinking with tax collectors and prostitutes and immoral people. And these religious people have a problem with Jesus because he's not following their form. He's not doing things the right prescribed way. And so they try to catch him. They're trying to figure out what is wrong with this guy. And they ask him a question about fasting. In Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 33, and if you hone in today, this can change your life. They said to him, the religious leader said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray. By the way, they weren't big fans of John either. John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking. Jesus answered, Can you make friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from him. In those days they will fast. He told them this parable. No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch on an old one. Otherwise they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, new wine will burst the skins, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one drinking old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better. Now, here's what I want you to see. Jesus is saying something that's fascinating, and if you grew up in church, you think you know what he's saying because you've heard it before. Jesus is saying, you got your old wine and you got your new wine, and I think we think he's saying something like, well, guys, I'm here now, and you used to have old rules, and now I'm going to give you some new rules. We think the New Testament is an updated version of the Old Testament. You've got your old rules, but now we have the new rules, and those are the ones that we live by. But it's actually much deeper than that. Look at how the story goes on in chapter 6, verse 1. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Which is a huge thing, because what he's doing isn't unlawful. Their traditions make it unlawful. It's unlawful because they say it's unlawful. Jesus never answered them. Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? By the way, this is brilliant, because this is a point in David's life when he has been anointed king, but nobody knows he's king yet. He's on the run trying to, stay alive from the sitting king Saul. So in this moment, Jesus is alluding to that's who he is. He's the Messiah. He's been anointed, but they don't know it. Anyway, so he says, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful for only priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, this is a huge thing for Jesus to say, because Sabbath was a huge thing for Jews. And it actually is a great principle that every one of God's people should still try to live by, because Sabbath means to cease, right? Sabbath was a gift. Sabbath was God's way of reminding us that we're not God. However, God did not lay down a lot of restrictions on how Jews should how they should take breaks on Sabbath. He told them some practical guidelines, but Jewish people added a lot to those practical guidelines. Y'all probably heard some of the rules. Like, one of them was you could not spit on a Sabbath because your spit might dig in the ground, and that would be considered work. And they added all kinds of silly rules like that. To this day, when you go to Israel, when I went there on Sabbath, Shabbat, they have Shabbat elevators, which just open on every floor, so no Orthodox Jew will have to push a button, because that would be considered work. These guys attack Jesus because he's not doing their man-made traditions, and he turns it right back on them. He tells them, look, I'm the king, and I'm Lord of the Sabbath. The problem wasn't that these disciples were missing the Sabbath. The problem was that they were missing who Jesus was. They didn't get he was the king. And their deeper problem was, by the way they were approaching their religion, they had forgotten who God was, and conversely, who God wasn't. We know that because of the very next story in verse 6. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue. This is chapter 6, verse 6. He went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, people who know the law, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at all of them and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was completely restored. Pharisees are kind of ticked off at this, but they're not the first ones. In the Gospel of Mark, there's a little added detail that it says in Mark chapter 3, if you could put that up. it says, he looked at them in anger. You want to know what Jesus gets mad about? This. What angers Jesus? He was grieved at the Pharisees' lack of love for another human being, at their hardness of heart. He's angry that they cared more about their own rule-keeping than about the restoration that God's kingdom brings. He's angry that they value and protect their reputation and status more than they care about healing and compassion. Jesus is angry because he sees the man with the shriveled hand and they don't. They just see an opportunity to break a rule. Jesus is angry because he loves the Pharisees too. He's frustrated. In Mark's words, he's grieved at their hardness of their heart because they won't let God's love reach them. And you want to know why? It's because self-righteous people are terrified of God. You're terrified of God. Self-righteous people are not going to be able to get to God because they're working hard to keep God from getting to them. They're building rules as a gate for their own protection. And the minute Jesus leaves, you want to know what these people start doing? They start planning how to kill him. They think they loved God right up until the moment they killed him. And you know why they're going to do it? Because they think Jesus has broken some kind of religious rule they got from God. But they didn't get those from God. And they forgot why God gave them the original stuff in the first place. So every city in the country has crazy laws. Little Rock has a lot. Do you know that in Little Rock it's illegal for dogs to bark after 6 p.m.? That's true. In Little Rock it is illegal for you to walk your cow down Main Street on a Sunday after 1 p.m. So you can do it in the morning, but not at 1 p.m. In Arkansas, it is illegal to keep your alligator in a bathtub. But I know some people that I think, all right, let's keep that one on the books, okay? Because I could see my extended family, upset about that law. But it's not just our state, all over the place. In California, it's illegal for a woman to drive in a bathrobe or to fry gravy. In Chicago, it's illegal to spit on the sidewalk. And there's all these kind of crazy, outdated laws that make me think, are these problems that we're having? Is anybody walking their cow down Main Street these days? That's kind of what's going on here. These laws originally had a purpose. Like in Chicago, it was so you wouldn't spread tuberculosis. And the intent is still the same. Don't spread tuberculosis. We've just figured out better ways to do that. Here's the thing I think we forget, and religious people, Christians, forget this. Jesus isn't against the Sabbath. Jesus kept the Sabbath. Jesus often withdrew and went to places to be alone and recharge and pray. But religious people, you know what they did? Religious people like us, they took this gift that God gave us, and they used it as a badge of self-righteous pride and competition. They started looking around to see if they were making sure they were keeping the Sabbath better than other people. And they even started using it as a badge of racial superiority. Jewish people took pride in their ethnicity, and Sabbath was one of their boundary markers. That's what the Pharisees are doing here. It's passive-aggressive code for we're better at honoring God than you are. We're better at keeping the rules than you are. And that's why Jesus says this in the story. And this church, I promise you, this has changed my life. It doesn't matter how much you read your Bible if you don't get this. Once I got this, I read my Bible totally differently. Jesus says it right here in this story. If you drill in on this, it changes the way you think about God, about Jesus, about church. It's just this. In Luke 6:9, he says, Jesus said, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? In Mark, in the same story, drilling in on it, here's how he said it on the Sabbath thing. Go to the next slide. He says, not that one. I gave you the wrong one. Okay, so it's in Mark. It's where Jesus says, Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Let's say that all together. Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Do you realize what Jesus is saying? Because I don't think we get it. Jesus is saying God did not create a religion, come up with all these rules and instructions, and then create people. That's often in the back of our mind. We think that's what God did. Here's the rules. Now I need to create some minions so that they can follow them. No. Jesus is saying what God is trying to give us is the best possible way to live. Every commandment is God inviting us into a better kind of life. God created humans and is trying to give us the best possible way to live, which means the things that we do, we're not doing for God. God is doing for us. And that brings me back to those animal sacrifices. Do you realize after Jesus, the early Christians are trying to make sense of their previous experience, especially these Jewish Christians. They're trying to make sense of all the thousands of years of why was God having us do this. And they started to realize what maybe you're starting to realize this morning. And so in the book of Hebrews, when they're trying to make sense of it all, they say, look at this. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices, repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. That's Leviticus language. Otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers would have been cleansed once and for all, and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices were an annual reminder of sins. The blood of goats and sheep didn't do anything. That's what all of a sudden these Christians are realizing. They only served as a reminder. God wasn't doing that for him. God was doing that for us. Sabbath is made for man. Man isn't made for the Sabbath. God was doing all those sacrifices for us. God was helping us be confident as we stood before him, helping to heal our offenses with each other, helping us to recognize the consequences of what we've done. And that's why Jesus quotes that verse to the Pharisees so often. Go and learn what this means. God doesn't want your sacrifice. You think that God is somehow in need of this? God is giving you this. The things that we do, the commandments that God, it's not because God is some kind of anxious, please worship, please get it, please get it right, please get it right. No, God has told us to do these things, not for his sake, for ours. Not because he's mad, but because he's for us. I've said a lot. I believe everything I used to believe, almost, but for deeper and better reasons. And here's what I mean by that. You can lie, and you'll break God's heart. You decide to lie a lot in your life, you'll break God's heart. But it's not because God doesn't know the truth. And it's not because God's offended. It's because God knows you're going to create a hell on earth for yourself. A hell of loneliness, mistrust, and isolation. God isn't commanding you to lie or not to lie because he doesn't know the truth. God commands it so you can live in community. Sex before marriage, not getting divorced, being generous to keep you from being greedy. These are not things God says to do because he's trying to rob you of something. It's because God is trying to give you something. And grace upon grace, if you've gone through any of that. This is the point of God has always been like this. God has always been like Jesus. God knows the pain sin causes us. God didn't give us these rules to take something away from us. But God really knows this is the best way to live. And that's why Jesus spends all his time with all the wrong people. With tax collectors and prostitutes. Because God is for them. He's trying to rescue them. God is not against them. God is not against us. God is not against you. God is and has always been like Jesus. And Jesus is good. One of my favorite theologians is a guy named Eugene Peterson. He was just a preacher in a small local church for decades. And at one point, he realized that people were reading the Bible, but they weren't realizing how revolutionary it was. It didn't make any sense to their life. And so he spent decades translating a conversational English version of the Bible, today you know as the Message. He also wrote a lot of books and preached a lot of sermons. And last year, Eugene Peterson died. And his son, at the funeral, stood up and weeping, he said, "My dad has fooled everybody for the last 3 decades." He said, for all his books he wrote and all the sermons he preached, my dad only had one message. It was a secret. It was a secret that he let me in on early in life. He used to sneak into our bedrooms and tell it to us at bedtimes. He would whisper it into my heart, and he's done it for 50 years. And it was just this that he told us all over and over and over again. You know God loves you. Do you know God is on your side? Do you know God is coming after you and He is relentless? That's what prodigals know and Pharisees don't. It's the very nature of God. God is not against you. God is for you. God has always been for you because God is like Jesus and Jesus is good. And that, church, that's good news. So if you're here today and you would like the prayers of some of our shepherds, they're going to be in the aisle. If something going on in your life, anything going on in your life, you just want to leave here lighter than you came, the shepherds take their place in the aisles right now. They're going to be praying for you. If you would like to put Jesus on in baptism, it really is this good of news. I'll be right down here. I'd love to receive your response. If you'll come forward while together we stand and worship.